You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
I've talked about fiction and war before. I've recently read something about fiction being used as intelligence for future warfare, or fiction intelligence. It's actually coined by a guest I've had on the show before. And it's about using fiction to understand where future war might take us. And that's probably about as much as I understand about this particular topic without finding someone who knows a little bit more than I do. Luckily, I've found them. G'day listeners and welcome to the Dead Prussian podcast. It's your host Mick here and thank you very much for all the support recently. Our listener numbers are going up quite steadily, so that's a good thing, I think, unless it's just my mum downloading lots of shows from different devices. Now, today's topic is one we've covered before, actually with a similar guest, actually with the same guest, but it's a bit different this time because it's based on the concept linking to one of our previous episodes. That's right, I've actually tied it to another episode. So we've talked a little bit about autonomy, and we've also talked a little bit about where future war will take us. But I want to talk about how that relates to the human sphere rather than just how it relates to where tech's going. You know, what does autonomy, what does the future of war mean for the humans who have to fight that war? So, I thought of a very good guest because he wrote a very good piece of fiction about it. My guest today is, of course, August Cole. He is an author and analyst exploring the future of conflict. He is a non-resident senior fellow with the Art of the Future project at the Atlantic Council's Brent Scowcroft Centre on International Security. He works on creative foresight at Spark Cognition, an artificial intelligence company, and is a senior advisor at FICINT, an independent strategy and management consulting firm focused on government-oriented industries. His first book, Ghost Fleet, a novel of the Next World War, that was published in New York by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt in 2015. It is an absolute cracker, and it was written with Peter W. Singer. In fact, we've done an episode on that, so go back through your Dead Prussian archives and have a listen to that one. He is a former defence industry reporter for the Wall Street Journal in Washington, D.C. as well, and most importantly, he's a friend of the show and a good bloke. August, thanks for coming on the show.
Nick, thanks for having me again.
Now, August, before we delve into the world of future war and using fiction to drive policy and strategy, can you tell my listeners a little bit about how you found yourself in this unique position of providing creative work for policy development?
My writing life began in journalism, and I think I got into writing journalism because I had realized that photojournalism, which was my original interest, wasn't going to be a path that I felt like was going to be viable long term. And yet I got to a point in my journalistic career when I was working at the Wall Street Journal and really wanted to spend more time delving into the gray areas and looking ahead. And it's not easy to turn your back on a great paper and a great town like DC, but it was clear to me that the things that really got me excited, and I felt like where there were a lot of big gaps out there, were the events or dynamics or technologies that were looming over the horizon that just couldn't quite get people's attention. And of course, in the news business, you're looking at what just happened. And I felt like the way to go at this was through fiction. And so I began this very experimental journey. I sometimes call it, a series of prototypes. Not all of it's been successful, and it's certainly not been as smooth as I probably would have wished at times. But the running experiment now is maybe, I'd say, 8 years in. And we're at this moment where there is a real appetite for not just novels like Ghost Fleet, but short fiction too, in official circles. I think because there's a lot of complexity out there that just is overmatched for the traditional ways to go about understanding the future and what's ahead.
It's actually quite cool using fiction to drive policy development, if I must say so myself. And I'm not the only one saying it, so I'm in pretty good company here. And so my first question relates to a particularly interesting project, a pretty cool project. And it's one that was recently released. It's a work of yours called Automated Valor. Can you tell us a little bit about the project, the story, what it is, and who sponsored it?
So this was a short story that explored what land warfare would be like in the 2030s. And it was commissioned by the British Army's Futures Group, which is wrestling with many of these same questions that obviously have to do with investment decisions today, but also strategy and doctrine too, for that matter. And so the story to me started to take shape when I was really thinking about this from the human experience of what it would be like to be a soldier, say 20 years from now, and to be in a different kind of a relationship with your unit than a conventional force might have today. And that would be because of the rise of machine learning algorithms or artificial intelligence that have the sorts of characteristics that we've seen in a film like Spike Jonze's Her, or the Siri, or Echo experience that everyday consumers have. So my aim there was to write a really ripping story, the kind of thing you just didn't want to put down, or you'd finish it and the people would say, "Well, write more." But also to nestle the characters into this world where some really kind of abstract ideas today, like what if the most charismatic person in your unit is a machine, or what if the very things that you're fighting for in an organized governmental force are different than what you're fighting for today. And in the case of the unit that I had portrayed in the story, who the adversary is, the way we conceive of who European nations might be in combat with today is different than what it would be like in the 2030s. And so the story allowed a lot of these things to interplay together. And I always think that's really important in a good, useful fiction type story, because it's too easy to have a very narrow view of what a given future might look like and not really understand that economics, social change and trends, technological breakthroughs, these things happen not in concert, but they happen, in a way that means that they're influencing one another. And the more perceptive we can be about that today, I think it helps us, reflect on a more accurate portrayal of what we, think things might be like in the future.
It's interesting to jump into the 2030s, and I mean, a lot of our listeners probably think, "Wow, that's so far off," but that's where a lot of this policy development is focused at the moment. So, I guess a Western military has commissioned a writer to depict the future operating environment in the 2030s. So, that's the British military, and they've asked you to write this. Why do you think they've done that rather than just have some major or lieutenant colonel or colonel sitting in a basement somewhere develop something that people can use as a concept?
There's certainly those kinds of approaches that are very important as well, that are internal. But sometimes having an external voice allows you to decouple from a lot of the expectations about how certain things might play out into the future. We've seen this in other fictional works that I've been able to be a part of. The Marine Corps Warfighting Lab essentially brought in a bunch of Marines to, in a kind of coordinated way, render the world that they envisioned in their, kind of keystone foresight document real. Because if they produced a traditional white paper that's a great synthesis of what the world of 2035 is like, some people will read it. If you produce a series of short vignettes that is actually like a graphic-rich, short story collection, a lot of people might read it. So we know that the ability to take internal voices works, but I think the value of having some outside perspective on this is that I'm just not beholden to the kind of institutional, biases or preferences, that there's not that kind of pressure that can be applied or otherwise, so that there's that editorial independence. And even if somebody says, please write whatever you want, which is, the case with this story too, of course, this, Automated Valor was my own kind of take on this. At the same time, the important thing is to not have any of the biases that are almost unconscious that are inherent in any of our writing. And I have my own too, I'm sure, so that someone who tackled this from their own perspective could produce an equally informative and hopefully helpful piece. And so the idea of being able to fuse all of these elements together, internal narratives, policy papers, external narratives, film, video, that kind of all fits into that FICINT basket that you mentioned in the introduction. That there is another tool set out there for foresight that is closely linked to the way we try to understand the world around us today through imagery intelligence or electronic intelligence or human intelligence, and in fact draws upon some of those elements but yet can do so from the stuff we all like to do anyway in many cases, which is read great stories, watch cool movies, even play video games. And I think that's something we can be more open to and find really, really valuable insight from. Again, one of the best, I think, examples of this is, a story like Automated Valor, really trying to understand what motivates people to fight. That's not something you often get when you're thinking about a future warfare scenario. And one of the kind of first order abiding questions that made me interested in this kind of an engagement in the first place was, I'm extremely interested in the kind of idea of coalition operations in the AI and robotics era. We hardly understand our own, and I say that as an American, efforts to explore next generation technologies and how to use them. We haven't even cracked the nut of what is the NATO piece of that going to look like, or our U.S. allies in the Asia-Pacific region or Indo-Pacific. The idea that these things will not again happen on our own terms or in a siloed way. And so Automated Valor as a story was a great way for me to kind of step back and really consider that heartily, that the experience, the military operation, if you will be different but similar, and it's really worth having a distinct understanding of that. And so having a magazine like Proceedings, which is from the U.S. Naval Institute, publish a story about a non-U.S. unit is fantastic because it gets to exactly this point.
Yeah, I like your use of the term fiction intelligence, or FICINT, which you coined, and it's gaining a lot of traction, mainly because you write some cracking stories, so people are going to listen to you quite a lot. But this is not the first time you've done this. I mean, our listeners know about Ghost Fleet, which is a book you can knock over in 48 hours, or 72 if you're a slow reader like myself. You've also had some other projects on the go, though. So you've done other short stories like Automated Valor. You've done one called Underbelly. You've done Operation Candlemaker. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the difference between using novels and short stories for this type of FICINT.
Sure. The really interesting thing about short stories links back to what I said about prototyping. I love the idea in 4,000 or 5,000 words or 6,000 words even to build a whole world and try desperately to make a character or a plot that is relatable and interesting so that someone finishes and just wants more. This ideally would be kind of a story that literally the next thing you think is what happens next. Yet you want to leave people satisfied too. It's sort of like a joke has to have a good punchline. Well, a short story has to have a good resolution. And each of those stories you mentioned are driven by an open-ended question. Underbelly, which is a story about a two-front war in Europe where the U.S. is not an active combat participant, explores this open-ended question of what rules would NATO break to respond to Russian hybrid warfare if it occurred in the Baltic states. And so it explores the very bloody side of tactical cyber, because I think that, again, is an assumption that that's an antiseptic type of conflict, and I don't anticipate that's going to be the case. It explores the social media domain and how we might exploit that to sow chaos and confusion, inside Russia's information loop. That is something that is best, of course, told through people and the human experience of, trying to run a war from a pub, which is really one of the fundamental, kind of features of that short story because of the information systems that have been compromised. Operation Candlemaker is a similar open-ended question on a slightly different tangent, which is, when might the U.S. use automated weapons, fully automated ones, for the first time in wartime, and why? And so this looked at that in the context of a U.S.-Iran conflict. So it follows a U.S. Navy captain who is in charge of a squadron as the only human. Although he has no real nominal control over it, he is the human on the loop. And it essentially is like a hood ornament, so to speak, inside the one vessel that has a captain in it. And it's sort of his experience, and that contrasts with a Ranger reconnaissance detachment in the mountains near a suspected weapon of mass destruction site. One of the big challenges in North Korea or Iran, of course, is there are a lot of different facilities and sites that will have intense U.S. interest to make sure that they're not accessed. Even if they are not posing an immediate threat, what's inside them or the people inside them could if they got free. So I posited that the U.S. would deploy automated weapons to essentially lock down those, like killbots really, to lock down those tunnels and bunkers. And so it's about the ethical choices and risks that go with that. Just like the maritime component of that story explores some of the unintended operational aspects of that in terms of how technology can fail us. I'm always interested in how stuff's going to go wrong. I'm always interested in what kind of rules people are going to have to break, because we don't often talk about that stuff before crises happen. But if you can do so, you can maybe get ahead of a problem down the road.
Yeah, it's uncomfortable. Talking about rules we have to break is uncomfortable, especially if things aren't going well. So I guess my penultimate question, and that's not a word for an awesome writing implement, people. It means my second to last question. Is, should we encourage art as a form of exploring future conflict? I'm pretty sure I know your answer to that. If so, how do we do it?
One of the best things in any large organization is top-down support. So when you have current and former military leaders like the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs Dempsey, you have Admiral Stavridis, who's now in academia at the Fletcher School. When you have leaders like that, for example, with their own writing, but also calling in a clear voice for more reading for the military profession of both fiction and nonfiction, it sends a great signal. And the other side of that is the bottom-up approach with organizations like Military Writers Guild, Strategy Bridge, which has embraced fiction, Divergent Options, Defense Entrepreneurs Forum, have all created space for alternative approaches to fairly traditional ways of working, and those sorts of channels are essential to making writing possible. And this can be something that is individual practice as much as it is collective or organized. Right, that's one of the great things about it. You can listen to a science fiction audiobook while you run, and you can talk about it when you're on the job. You can play video games and say to your spouse, "I'm doing it for work," and you can actually mean it. These are kinds of things that are not painful to integrate into your day, where trying to read a 80-page white paper on an overnight flight, as I'm sure many of us have tried to do, it's going to put you to sleep. The sci-fi writer Max Brooks, who we've worked with the Art of the Future Project and in other facets at the Modern War Institute at West Point, likens white papers to printed Ambien, and they can have that effect. I obviously say that as someone that's worked on white papers and works on them. So the idea of making it practical, of turning that FICINT into product, I think is relying on that top-down cover to do so, and always asking yourself, what is the first and second order effect of what I'm reading in this story if that were to come true? And as people begin to construct their own narratives, to use Ghost Fleet as a verb, as one former Army general or one current Army general did when he was planning, the idea that you can make the content that you're writing more rich with narrative, with storytelling, I think is something that shouldn't be lost on anybody in any organization, military, civilian, or otherwise. It just simply makes communication and engagement with people that much more interesting.
Yeah, it's the top-down approach, I think, is quite interesting. If you go on social media at the moment, ladies and gents, you'll see that the Australian Army's actually got a training centre, the Army's Logistics Training Centre. It's actually running a sci-fi fiction competition for print, media, film, in terms of like photos and imagery and it's basically art, to try and drive some questions about the future of logistics. And I think the work that you've done, August, is probably a good way of driving those sorts of interests from the top down as well. So we could probably talk about this for a while, but you've actually got to take off to an event. I've got to do some housework, so we won't talk about this all day. In fact, your event's a very cool event, which I'll talk about at the end of the show. But I'll ask my final question, one you've answered before, and it's one I ask of all my guests, and it relates to our mission on the show to define war in as many ways as possible, just like Big Carl, the dead Prussian, himself did, because war is a very important question for societies to ask themselves. So I ask each guest to finish the sentence, war is. So, August, I ask you to finish the sentence again, war is.
So before I answer this, I'm going to do a quick shout out to General McRyan of the Australian Army for his support of science fiction. And I should have mentioned him in that prior answer. And so I will now get to the conclusion of the show with this ultimate question. And what I'm going to say is a variation on my answer the first time, which was war is a contest of narratives. And this answer for this show, because it's now been a couple of years since I've had the honor of being on it, again, is I would say war is a real-time contest of internal and external narratives. And so I think that's updated and significantly so, to the sense that as someone who loves history like me, I think I came into trying to figure out the way the world worked through the kinds of narratives that were written post fact. And now we just know that that's not the case, that the history is either being written ahead of time or real time. And I think that's incredibly important. And the idea of narrative being both an internal and external contest has so many different facets to it that it seems like a really significant way to, mark that out too. And the way that conflict is going to be evolving, with technology, with social dimensions, the next couple.
Well, that definition definitely works for this show because we're all about defining and discussing, and internal, external narratives are kind of where we have our bread and butter. As you know, you've been on the show twice now. So, ladies and gentlemen, please have a look at August's fiction, Ghost Fleet, his short stories. I could give you all the web addresses, or I could just tell you to use this thing called Google because they're still operating, even though the GDPR's come through and sent me heaps of emails. Now, August is also off to an event. So, August, before I say goodbye, where are you off to next?
I was able to write a story in a collection called Strategy Strikes Back, how Star Wars explains modern military conflict. And in Boston tonight, we have an event for the book at DIUX Boston, along with the Air Force Kessel Run Group, which is a programming hotshot team, and Dan Ward, who is a retired Air Force officer who works now for an FFRDC, will be there talking about his perspectives on how acquisitions in Star Wars can help us in the real world. And so it's one of the many events that we've been running to support Strategy Strikes Back. I encourage people to buy the book on Amazon. We sold out actually the first print run, which is extraordinary. And we're really going to try to hopefully get people to burn through the second, because it's a very useful book. And to your point about making fiction accessible and useful, it is a really, really smart group of writers, ranging from Doctrine Man to the brighter sci-fi writers out there like Max Brooks, superbly edited by Jane Gates and John Amble and Matt Kavanaugh. So I think it's worth picking up this fine book from Potomac Books.
That is an excellent plug, ladies and gents. I've also heard that there's a pretty poorly constructed chapter in there from a amateur podcaster with a silky smooth voice. So make sure you check out Strategy Strikes Back, Chapter 4, and get yourself a copy because, as August said, they're selling out fast. Now, August, thank you very much for coming on the show. Good luck with your event this evening, and I hope to hear from you soon.
Mick, thanks again.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to support August, of course you can buy his books, read his fiction, and you can also tell your mates to buy his books and read his fiction. And you can follow him on Twitter at August_Cole. I'd like to go through and advertise a heap of stuff, including the Strategy Strikes Back book, but we've kind of done that in a very sneaky way already. So, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at the Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.